What was your prior experience with media representation and documentary filmmaking prior to Love Me, Bait Me?
Yeah. So I did not have any prior experience with documentary filmmaking. This was my first official project. It is kind of nice to think about future projects that could happen. Becoming a quote unquote documentary filmmaker wasn't on my bingo card, so to speak, but this was just born out of a passion and inspiration. And this was the medium and form that it took. As far as representation goes, though, I mean, that's inherent to the project. When I was younger and about 13 years old, that's when I discovered my queerness for the first time. And that was because of being on YouTube and finding videos from scenes from TV shows and movies of that time. So this probably would have been, mid 2000s. But also, of course, whatever had been produced up until that point. So a lot of films and shows from the 90s. And yeah, that was really central to my, you know, self-awareness. So I hold that dear to my heart. Um, and so I can understand and relate to others who have a very similar experience where they saw the right scene and all of a sudden things started to click for them. Yeah.
So, as this documentary was born out of Alexa's death, when did you decide that the documentary was the right way to showcase both the history and the importance of representation?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's funny. It's looking back, this would have been in 2016. Lex's death on broadcast television was that March. And I wasn't following along in real time. I got the referral from Margot on the project earlier. I would say maybe like mid that year in like summer, maybe in the fall. And because we went to school together, and she said, "There's this great show, you'd love it." I didn't know what happened in the third season, so it was a surprise to me watching, episode 307, and was devastated. It really, upon looking back, was triggering very similar feelings that I had had when I was in my early teens, and so it felt very familiar. And the difference being now I'm in college and I, identify as a feminist activist, and I'm doing programming on the college campus. And so I was just in a different situation. And, so much had changed as far as the cultural climate and, attitudes and legislation regarding the LGBTQ plus community. So it just, felt like, okay, well, I have to do something about this. I just felt so moved emotionally. And initially, it was just wanting to attend an event with like minded people. But then when I found news about Klexicon, which was the convention that also was inspired by Lex's death and all the activism, the fan activism that happened afterwards, um, I wanted to go. And when I was looking at who was invited to present or sit on panels and give these workshops, it just felt like a really great opportunity to record or speak with all of these people. Because, when were we going to have another opportunity like this? And so, yeah, around the, election, certainly, um, similarly devastated by the results in, November 2016. So it all just kind of merged together at that point. I can't remember exactly if it was right before or right after the election, but it was certainly around that time where it felt like, okay, well, we got to do something. And I had such a personal connection to the content, and it felt and I also had dabbled with, video cameras growing up in my early teens. There's lots of videos on YouTube that I would post. And so the idea of working with cameras again was really fun. And yeah, so just kind of went from there, realizing, well, all it takes is a couple cameras. I had watched This Film Is Not Yet Rated, and the private investigation that they did of the MPAA in that film, it wasn't done with the highest quality cameras, and I still got so much out of it. So it really gave myself permission to be like, it's all about the conversation and what you get. And of course, I still cared about quality and all of that, and I got good advice from folks at my college. But yeah, being inspired by that documentary, certainly from a young age, in my brain, I knew this was you know, a great way to do it, if that makes sense.
What was the process of assembling the production team and the subjects to interview on camera?
Yeah. So naturally, the people that were invited to Clexicon, that first year, the inaugural convention was in March 2017. That certainly was sort of um, those people were already chosen for me, if you will. It was just the process of going through that list and comparing different backgrounds and identities and experiences that these folks had. And then similarly, because I had always known, I loved watching documentaries, and the documentaries that I had always really enjoyed, I was, going to their, Wikipedia pages and seeing like, wow, they interviewed like over 40 people. Like, that's incredible. And that's really that kind of became the number for me. I was like, oh, if I can get that many people together, that would be great. And so at some point I knew like this was only just the beginning. I think we interviewed 10 people that first year. And I thought I would try my luck doing that again the following year. So Margot and I went again in 2018. And I only conducted a couple interviews then. We didn't do any in our hotel room. It wasn't the same setup, but that was where we met Erica, our editor. I had experience, working at the queer feminist activist center on college campus. I was very familiar with tabling and having buttons and selling merchandise and giving out, information and resources. So I thought, well, let's just become one of the other vendors. And we did it under the Clexa Project name. And that's how Erica found us. And, we did a few interviews, at the table itself, but, again, the quality kind of got in the way. It was still a great way to meet people. And so that was how we met Erica. In 2018, Margot and I moved to Portland from Chico, California, Portland, Oregon. And Erica also lived in Portland, Oregon at the same time. So it just felt like a perfect match. And I knew, we had all this content, but I didn't have any editing experience. And of course, I would have loved to have edited them myself, but to be very realistic, it's so helpful to have other people involved. Otherwise, things just kind of don't always get to happen. So she started the work of compiling a lot of these interviews. And in that following year, 2019, Erica and I went back and did another round similar to the 2017 year. So maybe we did like 10 more interviews, let's say, in 2019 from Erica's hotel room. And that was fantastic. And again, it was just looking at who was invited to Clexicon that year. And so by that point, we have over 20 interviews, give or take. And Erica, again, is spending the next year compiling and trying to, make connections and figure out what flow makes sense. And I think it was in late 2019, Bren Combs, our producer, a producer on the film, found me on Twitter and offered help. And so that got the ball rolling. I really saw the value in having someone who had more experience than me, someone who could help me in the realm of fundraising and marketing. So Bren came on, And of course, the pandemic happened soon after. And so we had plans and those had to shift. We had all kinds of plans, but by the end of 2020, we finally, told ourselves like, okay, let's just do it. We'll do a Kickstarter. So we did that Kickstarter and we were able to raise over 10 grand. And that is the reason why we were able to bring on Pao and Titus, the composer and animator. And it became clear at some point, between conversations with Erica and I, like we really wanted to have music that was compelling, emotionally. We really saw the value in that, and also animation because there were a lot of statistics, and we had some pretty big dreams, and we weren't able to do all of them. We got some two-dimensional character animation in there. We were able to get some in, and with that Kickstarter being successful, POW was selected through a process of, we put out a call for composers on Twitter. And so we interviewed a bunch of people and compared folks and, made the hard decision. And POW was just the best fit in the world. POW lives in Mexico City. And Titus, I had already become aware of their work through a mutual contact in Portland. I'd found their Instagram and just loved their style of animation. So I kind of already knew. I'm like, I'm going to approach Titus at some point, but I need to have money. So I'm not going to ask anyone to do work for free. So yeah, the Kickstarter allowed us to do that. And we were able to put, this little tiny team together. And then it just kind of went from there. And we were able to, include more folks throughout the process, thanks to Powell, thanks to another connection that I had in Chico, being able to license some music from a musician in Chico. That felt really meaningful, to include as much as we could in this film, queer artists, trans artists, in the making of this documentary. It's kind of a no-brainer that, what one of our major themes is, you need to hire the queer and trans community in the making of your stories, and that obviously applies to the making of this documentary. So it was really important that we were able to do that, and grassroots organizing really came through. And so we were able to get enough resources together to bring folks together. So yeah, that's kind of the gist of that story.
And what was the most surprising thing you learned in the process of creating Love Me Baby?
Yeah, I surprised myself in a lot of different ways. I think one of them being that I had always kind of seen myself as not a creative person, which is kind of strange because I was really into art growing up. But, the story I told myself was I'm just really good at like looking at something else and like copying it. I can, but in terms of like actually creating something brand new, I had always struggled with that concept, in terms of my imagination. So I just always kind of told myself like, well, you're just really good at, maybe collecting information or, reorganizing it in a different way. So this documentary makes sense. Like all these brilliant people will tell me all their brilliant things, and then I'll just work behind the scenes and, um, put it all together in some shape or form. So I certainly had this story that I told myself about what kind of person I was, and, that I was more of a left brain person, if you will. But over time, I started to have more of an interest in, watching, it's fun creating a documentary about queer representation. And then every TV show and movie you watch, you're like, oh my gosh, should this go in the film? Like, how does this relate? And so everything was interconnected, and still not seeing representation that I really wanted. For me, like on a personal level, like wanting to see representation that reflected the relationship that I was in with Margot in particular, and just never seeing it. And so that kind of, for me, inspired a desire to potentially look into storytelling myself. What would it look like to write a story of my own? And it turns out it's really hard. The creative process is really hard. And it was really frustrating, but I've learned so much, and I've really learned that actually, everyone, is capable of creativity. We all have our own unique blocks and barriers, that keep us from, that creative side, but we all have it, it's innate. And there's also a very spiritual component to it for me. And it's very empowering. And so I surprised myself, I think, with the fact that one, would be interested in creating something of my own. I really wasn't anticipating that. And then, the aftermath of that for me, uh, it really helped me build a lot of empathy for other creatives, writers, producers, directors, all of these folks who are creating all of these stories in the mainstream or, independently, and realizing like, oh my gosh, it really is so much easier to tear something down than it is to like actually create something from the ground up. And although the film was born from a lot of anger and devastation about like why would you do this to our community, and this desire to have a honest, well researched critique, I really started to build a lot of empathy for like just how nuanced the process is, and it isn't black and white, and as easy as I thought that it would be. And so I'm grateful for that too. It also makes the conversation easier to have with these folks, can, find common ground in that way. So yeah, a lot of personal growth for sure.
And finally, what are your current favorite TV shows and movies that you feel are doing representation really well?
Yeah, I personally love the TV show Motherland Fort Salem. I love witchy content and queer content. And when I, first discovered this show, I was just so amazed by the representation on that show. Yeah, it was, I mean, in my opinion, so well done. And of course, it's an interesting show because it does involve uh, the idea of, these witches being the military for the United States. And that as a concept is tricky. It's one of those things where it's like, I don't know if I really want to get behind, supporting, you know, war and the military. But of course, the story itself is so nuanced, and that's kind of the point, right? And so, that aside, so sort of like first, impressions, you're like, I don't know, I don't know about this, but the way they do it, just it's fantastic, and I really love that. It's so nuanced, and it's so well done. And there was another one. What was another one that ugh, I'm such a sucker for the movie Bottoms. I just think that movie is so funny. I just really enjoy the like raw kind of, we're really kind of pushing the envelope in terms of humor. And yeah, it's just like not having everything as far as like queer representation goes really polished. And so I really appreciated that movie. It's just so funny to me. I love love that movie. So those two definitely stick out to me. I watch a lot of queer content, so I kind of like everything. One of the things that we critique in, well, yeah, one of the things that we talk about in the film or we bring attention to is period films, or period dramas, and specifically the whiteness of it all. But I do love a good period drama. I'm not gonna lie, and I don't know why. There's something about, for me, I think maybe it has a lot to do with history and just like, a fascination for, how people lived 100, 200 years ago. Like it, and the queerness that, intersects with that. I think it's also like validating, for me, just the fact that like queer and trans folks have lived, and existed forever. And so anytime I see something that validates that, I growing up, I will say, tried and true, my favorites are anything written by Sarah Waters. And so Fingersmith and Tipping the Velvet were really instrumental for me growing up. Yeah, especially compared to like what was available at the time. For me, they were just really well written, interesting, complex stories, and like positive, you know. So I still feel really inspired by those pieces to this day, and try to find ways to integrate those themes into stories that I'm interested in now.